This roundtable presentation, titled A Transdiagnostic Approach to Sleep and Circadian Challenges Faced by Youth, was hosted by the Evidence-Based Services Committee Hawaii on July 8, 2022. Our presenter for this July roundtable was Dr. Allison Harvey. Dr. Allison Harvey is a clinical psychology professor and the Golden Bear Sleep and Mood Research Clinic Director at the University of California, Berkeley. Her clinical training and Ph.D. were completed in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Harvey then moved to the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry and then became a faculty member in the Department of Experimental Psychology at Oxford. She was also a fellow at the St. Anne's College. In 2004, she moved to UC Berkeley. Dr. Harvey's research is currently funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Her research interests include sleep disorders and mental illness for adolescents and adults, as well as transdiagnostic approaches to treatment development, behavior change, sleep, and comorbid concerns. She has published over 250 research articles and book chapters and has authored 3 books. Dr. Harvey is a recipient of numerous awards, including from the American Association for Behavior Therapy, the Beck Institute for Cognitive Therapy and Research, and the National Alliance for Research on Schizophrenia and Depression. Dr. Harvey has also been awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Åbo, Sweden, and is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. She has also served on national and international committees, including the Executive Committee of the Academy of Psychological Clinical Science and the Review Committee for the Psychological Clinical Science Accreditation System. Please enjoy Dr. Harvey's presentation on a transdiagnostic approach to sleep and circadian challenges faced by youth.
Why this is a huge problem. One is that sleep difficulties predict the onset of mental illness a couple of years later. So this is a study on depression, but we see this for a number of mental health challenges. And it gets very serious. Sleep difficulties very clearly predict suicide risk. And we see this regardless of the methods you use to assess sleep and regardless of the methods you use to assess suicide. And this is across suicide attempt and suicide ideation. So it is the possibility that if we can intervene in sleep, we might be able to prevent or reduce the risk of relapse for youth who have mental health challenges or might develop or are vulnerable for mental health challenges. So just to set the background, there are a myriad of unique factors that converge for adolescents in terms of their sleep. With the onset and progression through puberty, there's a tip toward owl-like tendencies of going to bed later and waking up later. And this is massively exacerbated by a host of psychosocial factors like interaction with peers and engagement in social activities through technology, media, well into the night. Relatedly, access to light and stimulating activities. And parents are not around as much to scaffold bedtimes. And then there's school and work and homework. And there's the big sleep in on weekends. And we call this social jet lag. And in fact, where I am in California, we talk to teens about you're basically flying to Hawaii on a weekly basis with our 3-hour time difference is a good illustration, and back again on a weekly basis. This is a huge problem for the circadian system. The circadian system just cannot adapt to that. So we'll be talking about that. But together, many youth are at risk of sleep deprivation and circadian dysregulation. And of course, we know that these kinds of problems cause a whole host of other problems that have real possibility of contributing to vicious cycles And these vicious cycles really have long-term consequences. Now, if that wasn't already enough, let's consider the brain development of youth. We know in the adolescent years that there's a temporal gap between the relatively more developed subcortical regions, important for emotion responding, and lesser development of the prefrontal regions, important for the management of all of those emotions. And so we've already got a gap between these, more development here and less development to control all those emotions. And sleep deprivation further amps this up and further dampens this down. So to use a phrase I've heard my colleague Matt Walker use, we've got all gas and no brake. And that can really have a lot of consequences for young people with the sleep deprivation. So there's another piece I just want to set up. And this is relevant, I think, to youth who have experienced trauma or are continuing to experience trauma. We can't sleep unless we're feeling safe. And indeed, birds go to nests and animals go to safe burrows in order to sleep. In a similar way, us humans, youth and adults, need to be feeling safe in order to be able to get off to sleep and stay asleep. So these are some of the sort of preliminary things that we want to be thinking about with our sleep interventions. Which of these variables are the youth we're working with experiencing? And which do we have to sort of bring in to our case conceptualization and our treatment plan? So another piece is, when we came to working with youth, we really thought we would just be treating insomnia. But we quickly learned that sleep and circadian disturbances don't always fit into neat diagnostic categories. There's all kinds of other problems. Youth who are spending too much time in bed or who have hypersomnia, they're different problems. Youth who go to bed very late and can't get up for school. Youth who, this is less common, who have an advanced phase, go to bed very early. Youth who are experiencing nightmares, nocturnal panic attacks. This is very common. Irregular bed and wake times, that's social jet lag, and other complexities. So given this complexity, this set of complexities, and that if we only focus on insomnia, we're not going to be fully serving the challenges that youth are experiencing. Along with Dr. Dan Bicey, who I know is a relative of one of the members of the state of Hawaii Department of Health, Scott. So it's great to make that connection. So along with Dan, we started to think about, is it possible to develop one treatment that might be helpful across sleep and circadian disturbances, maybe across mental, and colleagues are working out physical illnesses, and maybe even across some phases of development. I'll be showing you the kind of work we do with 10 to 18-year-olds. But a lot of these principles are very helpful for people at various stages of life. Now, if this were possible, I think it would be a good thing. I'm very interested in, a lot of our work now is on dissemination and implementation in community mental health centers across California. And we're always thinking about how to use the training opportunities in a cost-effective way. And if we can train providers in one treatment that covers multiple problems, that obviously is advantageous. So this is the first version of this treatment, the transdiagnostic intervention for sleep and circadian problems. So the word transdiagnostic is just referring to this idea that we're trying to treat across sleep and circadian problems and across different kinds of mental and physical illnesses. And this is a look at the treatment. There are the cross-cutting modules that you'll be very familiar with. They're the basic building blocks of many of our psychosocial interventions. And then there are the core modules that are the basic building blocks of sleep health that all of us need. And then there are the optional modules that we bring in depending on the specific problem that each person is experiencing. And, just to shout out here, this was inspired, this idea of a modular treatment by Bruce Chorpeda and John Weiss. And I know, the work that they've been doing on Match is also a modular treatment. And that has been very helpful, I think. And so we sort of modeled in that tradition. Now, we think very hard about how to develop treatments. And this treatment that I'm going to share with you and give you a taster of is grounded in the basic sleep and circadian science. It's grounded in a sleep health framework I'll say something about in a moment. And you're going to see principles from evidence-based treatments, the ones listed here. So the sleep health framework, I think, is really cool. This comes from my colleague and Scott's brother-in-law, that emphasizes that, sure, we need to diagnose and treat sleep disorders, but we need to do so much more than that. We need to improve our sleep health across each of these dimensions. We need regular sleep. We need satisfying sleep. We need to be alert in the day. We need to pay attention to the timing of our sleep, ideally falling in the nighttime hours. We need shift workers for sure. That's another topic for another time. And we need sufficient duration of sleep. So the transdiagnostic treatment I'm going to give you a taster of helps young people to develop sleep health along these dimensions. Now, in terms of the evidence base, there's 2 published studies with reasonable sample sizes of this approach. And there's several other studies with a broad range of other populations in progress. And as I said, it's drawing from evidence-based treatments and combining them for reasons that I will get into. So let me give you a mini taster of this approach. And I want to start with a biological grounding because it's super interesting and it helps to be able to describe some of this to clients because it provides the rationale and often the motivation for trying things that otherwise people wouldn't be that happy to try. So in doing this, I want to invite you on a thought exercise with me. I invite you to cast your mind to the rhythmic nature of the world all around us and to notice that night follows day and day always follows night. There are 4 seasons in most parts of the world. In the place I live, it seems like it's more like 12 seasons. I'm not sure what Hawaii is like in terms of seasons, but there are irregular seasons wherever we are, whether it's 4 or more or less. Stars have annual patterns. Some flowers close at night and open in the day, and some birds migrate annually or biannually. And I think it's really wonderful to tune into these rhythms because often we're moving so fast that we lose contact with them. And then let's tune into our body rhythms. There's a circadian rhythm that is about 24 hours and 10 minutes in humans. There are ultradian rhythms, rhythms of less than 24 hours. For example, you'll notice that your rhythm of being able to concentrate, remember, and attend varies across the day. You might be pretty good at those cognitive functions at 9 a.m. You're probably not very good at those cognitive functions at 2 p.m. That's a natural ultradian rhythm. There are infradian rhythms, rhythms of greater than 24 hours. An example is the menstrual cycle in females. So we have these incredibly rhythmic bodies. And I think often we're out of tune with them because we're medicating our rhythms with coffee in the morning, maybe alcohol or cannabis at night. And so we're not aware of our rhythms. But human sleep is incredibly rhythmic. We know this when we put polysomnography on people, these electrodes on their scalp, near the eyes and under the chin area, neck area. And that helps us to stage sleep. This is a typical night of sleep for young adults. Sleep varies a little bit across the age range. When we get into discussion time, I really welcome adult questions as well as young people questions, because I figured that, us all working in this field really need to be sleeping well too. Our jobs are difficult and we're more likely to be able to look after ourselves, prevent burnout, etc., if we're sleeping well. So I really welcome questions about adult sleep too. So what happens is we fall asleep and we go down to these deeper stages of sleep, important for growth, repair, immune system functioning. If I wake you up there, it's no problem. It's not dangerous. You'll just be cranky with me. Then you go up and you get some rapid eye movement sleep. This is where we do most of our dreaming. Our eyes are moving. If you've got a baby at home, watch them sleeping. You'll see they have more REM sleep than we do. So you see them a lot of the time in REM sleep. Important for emotion processing, for memory consolidation. Stage 2 sleep, you'll see we get a lot of the night. This is an interesting stage of sleep. If I wake you up in stage 2 sleep, most of you will tell me, I was awake. What are you talking about? I was awake. So it's a lighter stage of sleep and people really don't think they're asleep, but it's an important stage of sleep. It's important for preparing the brain for next day learning. So youth love hearing about this, actually. Many youth love hearing all of this. We also point out that awakenings are part of sleep. Certainly as we move through the age range, it's completely typical to get up and go to the restroom at least once. If it's like 3 or more times, then we'd probably work with the person on that. But I'm slipping into adults, back to youth. The other thing that we point out is if something woke you up in the middle of the deep stage, when you get back to sleep, you'll go back into the stage you most need. So we also explain to youth, and I want to explain to you, that there are 2 processes that control our sleep: the homeostatic pressure to sleep, or the appetite to sleep, and the circadian rhythm. And so here's the homeostatic pressure to sleep. Many of you, I think, will be this kind of sleeper. You wake up at 7 a.m., you go to bed at 11 p.m. I wish our youth clients had this kind of sleep too. Their sleep is shifted, usually later. But here's what happens. You wake up and this homeostatic pressure to sleep, or the appetite to sleep, is very low early in the morning. But as we stay awake, it builds and builds and builds and builds. And ideally at our bedtime, it's maximal and it'll help us to fall asleep and stay asleep. If we take a nap, it's going to discharge the homeostatic pressure to sleep. And depending on the timing and the length of the nap, we might not be able to build back up sufficient homeostatic pressure to sleep to get us through the night. So that's one part of sleep. The other part of sleep is the circadian rhythm. Now, this links to screen time. So you need to know this, in my opinion, and it's beautiful biology. So we have clocks in every cell and organ of these bodies of ours. We have the central clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that controls the circadian system. and it's very responsive to light and dark. So if you want to make a change to your sleep, we want dim light conditions the hour before bedtime. We want bright light conditions on waking. So that, of course, is part of the transdiagnostic treatment. But we have clocks in every other cell and organ of these bodies of ours, and they interact at their own rates and interact with all of the other clocks. But here's the problem. This orchestra of clocks is in tune when we have regular bedtimes and regular wake-up times. But very often youth have many late nights on Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, and on weeknights, they try to bring their bedtime earlier and they just can't do that. They've got a kind of a double desynchronization occurring where this orchestra of clocks is out of tune. And that basically means that there's desynchronization between the internal clocks and external time, and between the different clocks and organs in the body itself. So in the transdiagnostic treatment, there's a big emphasis on regular bedtimes and regular wake-up times. But guess what? Youth do not want to do that. Understandable. I remember being that age, and I did want to sleep in on the weekend and go to bed later on the weekend. So we try to do some harm reduction and try to do some motivational interviewing to come around to a wake-up time on Saturday and Sunday that's about 2 hours different to school day wake-up time. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But this is a picture of the great biology, picture of the brain looking at the top down. And you can see that there's a fast neural pathway from the retina through to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's the part that controls the sleep and circadian system, and on through to the pineal gland. Now, it's the pineal gland that secretes melatonin. So we don't need to take it, unless your physician says to take it, I guess. The brain releases it, but guess what? Well, we know that melatonin causes us to feel sleepy, but we need darkness to have the release of melatonin. So it can only be released in darkness or dim lights. It cannot be released in the night. So if you want more about melatonin, dim those lights. And so this kind of rationale really helps young people to start to think about their screen time, because we can be awake way past a reasonable time if we're in the light, because our melatonin can't kick in to help us to fall asleep. So, we talk a lot about darkness in the treatment. Sleep is really important, but darkness is really important too for us. So as I've said, it triggers melatonin release, makes you feel sleepy. And so I think we need to really think again about the major lights. If we're getting up to the restroom in the night, ideally not switching on that big light at night, using dim light. And we also need to be thinking about the things that are getting in the way of melatonin onset, all these sources of light. Now, of course, the iPhone, the laptop, they all now have night mode. And I do recommend that people switch. You go into system preferences, you go into display, then you can see options for nighttime mode. And I suggest you use them. But, I don't know how, I don't think anyone knows. I wonder whether any of my colleagues have done this. I should check on this. But how effective they are, I do not know. We do know that blue blocking glasses, so I've got mine here because I wear glasses, they fit over the top. So these are quite effective, but they cost money and many people don't have money. But, there are various ways to try to get that blocking of light. And so we have a discussion with young people. What kinds of lights are you exposed to? What time do you switch off your lights at night? We also have the conversation with young people about what time do they go to bed on weekdays and weekends. And we talk about this jet lag model. I'm in California. What's it like to fly over to New York City? This is not something that's good for us. It's pretty clear to be doing this too often. So we ask you, are you chronically jet lagged? And we're trying to build the rationale for regularizing bedtimes and regularizing wake-up times. And it's relevant here that we get our best sleep when we're in the habit of going to bed and waking up at the regular times, because this is going to ensure that the homeostatic pressure to sleep and the circadian pressure to sleep both peak at the same time. So that's our goal that all of us should be working toward. I want to talk briefly about assessment. The most important assessment for this field is a daily sleep diary. It's so practical. You can adapt it. You can add a question about alcohol use. You can add a question about cannabis use, about daytime energy. It lets us establish baselines and assess if the intervention we're doing is helping or not. We do need to train youth. The way we train youth is to show them a sleep diary and to fill out one night of it based on last night's sleep. So we go through all of the questions. Here's something that seems counterintuitive. We don't want people to watch the clock. Believe it or not, we did an experiment a bunch of years ago where we got some people to monitor the clock and some people to monitor a digit display unit. And those who monitored the clock got more anxious about their sleep and actually ended up misperceiving their sleep more. So ask people to base their judgments on the sleep diary on their felt sense, their best guess. And there are so many variables that we can score from the sleep diary. And I'm going to be sending these resources over to Brad, and as well as some other kind of sleep diary resources, because it's just so helpful. Here's a sleep diary of a client that Sandra Taub, a therapist and project coordinator, who's working with me right now, worked on with her client. This was at session 1. So the client is going to bed at about between 1 and 2 a.m. Well, the good news is it's somewhat regular, I guess. It's not uncommon to see very irregular bedtimes. Take a fair amount of time to go to sleep. So I'm kind of very interested in what their wind down is like. This is fine though. Anywhere within 30 minutes is fine, because the moment of falling asleep, it's not like a sleep switch. It's more like a dimmer switch. It takes time. Once you turned out the light, this person maybe turned off technology to downregulate and go off to sleep. Now, wake up time, it's fairly regular. This is good news, actually. But look here, total sleep time averaged across the week is about 5 hours. So, already we can see here some treatment targets. We want to bring the bedtime forward. This person has a delayed sleep phase. They're a night owl. So we want to bring their bedtime forward. They're probably also spending like an hour in bed on Saturday and Sunday, also on Friday. So we want to start to think with them about whether they could get up out of bed, say after about 15 minutes, because we mainly want to keep the bed associated with sleep, not with waking. So, on the sleep diary, we can look for how regular and irregular bedtime is. On that diary, it was pretty good. Same with wake time. Are there long sleep onset latencies? I regard long as anything longer than 30 minutes. Are they snoozing in the morning? This person was snoozing for an hour on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday? And do they wake up during the night? And if so, for how long? That is less common for youth. It's much more common for adults. And notice if there are any naps. It's not an uncommon pattern for young people to come home from school, eat a big snack, go off and have a nap for 90 minutes, get up, have some free time, playtime, then hook into homework at about 7 p.m. And that nap basically pushed the bedtime back quite a bit. So often, if we can work with that nap and replace it, with some other something else that's still pleasurable, we can go a long way to improving the young person's sleep. Another one is just to get to know the client's sleep. We do this with there's many ways to do this, but this is one way where we're basically getting the CBT model. The things I do, that's the behavior. The things I think, that's the cognition. The things I feel, emotions. And we want to get this for a bedtime. If they wake up in the nighttime, if not, skip that. On waking, if they're having trouble getting up in the morning, and during the day. So let me give you an example of this, and thanks to Steph, another project coordinator and therapist on the team here at UC Berkeley. This client, I think, is like 21, so maybe a little bit older than some of the clients you're seeing. So this client ate a late dinner, smokes weed to wind down as part of the bedtime ritual, just to kind of relieve anxiety and stress. And in bed has lots of thoughts about the time, how late is it, does kind of mental math about how much sleep she's going to get, and thoughts about relationships and friends. She's feeling anxious, she's feeling determined, she's feeling active, hypervigilant. And we derive the consequence of all of this. So she said the phone screen time impacts the quality of sleep and doesn't allow the body to recognize that it's ready for sleep. The weed feels positive because it alleviates anxiety. But I believe she went on to say, but she wasn't sure that it actually helps sleep itself, or whether it actually got in the way of sleep. And it does seem from the literature that it has different impacts on different people. When she wakes up in the morning, much more briefly this time, she's thinking and feeling excited about when she can go back to sleep again. She doesn't want to be awake, and she's dreading being awake and starting the day. So this is very helpful. It's really going to help us to come up with a treatment plan collaboratively with her to try out different things in kind of like a mindset of just doing an experiment. Young people often don't want to commit to, say, never using weed again, but they will often try just on like a 1 week occasion, seeing what it's like to use relaxed mind strategies rather than weed, and see what happens. Now, we didn't try that with this person. That's probably not a typical example, but that's the attitude that we have in the treatment, one of just conducting experiments to see what happens. So I want to talk about these pieces somewhat briefly. Regularizing bedtime and wake-up time. It actually is not that easy to do. It typically takes several weeks. I would suggest setting a long-range goal for regular bed and wake times by the end of treatment, because with sleep, we want to make small changes. Like tonight, if you're used to going to bed at 2 a.m. and you try going to bed at 10 a.m., it's not going to work. The circadian clock cannot move backward that amount in one night. So we set short-range goals in which we have small steps that make progress toward the long-term goal. And usually they're 30 to 60 minutes each week. Actually, the circadian system can adjust to bigger changes than that, but we'd prefer to get smaller changes, get mastery, and then continue. And we're really emphasizing the importance of minimal fluctuations across the nights of the week. And we're helping young people problem solve all that gets in the way. And now this might not seem like maybe something we should be doing. Like sometimes I go, a wind down, am I really going to be helping someone with a wind down? But actually the answer is yes, because most of us need help with our wind down. We come up with a personalized wind down collaboratively with the client, where they're engaging in relaxing, sleep enhancing activities. They're reducing light, reducing or ceasing substance use. It's highly individualized, it's devised collaboratively, ideally starts at the same time every night. This is an example. This was an adult client who had bipolar disorder, GAD, who I treated some years ago. Her wind down was no news shows, only reruns. She's not going to read work stuff. And if she's anxious, she's going to tune into her thoughts, write them down on negative automatic thoughts forms. Now, the rise up routine. This is the most important. If there's one thing I hope you're going to remember in 10 years, it's this. If you're having trouble with your sleep, pick a wake-up time, and regardless of the sleep you have, make that the anchor around which everything else can align. We also need to educate people that awakenings are difficult. I won't ask for a show of hands, but it kind of is fun to ask for a show of hands of who is the person in the room who wakes up and is like bouncing around, all happy, full of beans. They're not very common. For most of us, awakenings are quite difficult. And we need this sort of brisk wake-up period where we're not hitting snooze on the alarm. We might make the bed, so the incentive to get back into bed is reduced. We head for the shower, we take a brisk walk, we get sunlight. And this, as I said, is individualized for the young person. And, you know, I said before that we expect at bedtime people to take like 20 to 30 minutes to fall off to sleep, because sleep is like a dimmer. It's not a light switch, it's a transition. Similarly, wake up. We're expecting that people will take like 30 to 60 minutes to fully wake up. And the sleep science field actually has a term for that, sleep inertia. It's the feeling of grogginess that occurs for the first hour on waking. And these feelings are normal. They indicate the transition from sleep and wake, and they don't necessarily indicate that you didn't get enough sleep. Now, there are young people and adults who can have sleep inertia for like 3 to 4 hours, often associated with depression, with bipolar disorder, with schizophrenia. And I can talk more about that if people are interested. Now, they're just kind of for humor. There's an alarm clock called Clocky, if you want to look at it, that will bounce around your room until you solve a puzzle on the top, and it will only be quiet at that point. There's another alarm clock that will shred your money if you don't get up. And I recommend, we don't have time to show it now, but I'll send these slides along. If you Google up the science of snoozing on YouTube, there's a wonderful little clip to show young people that they really like, and makes a really good therapy point about not sleeping in. Now, I'm going to just show you this very quickly, and then I'll talk about it.
Turn off the water. She wakes up to turn it back on.
You've heard of Pavlov's dog. This is Pavlov's daughter.
She feels the temperature. And then she goes back to sleep. Do it again, Tyler.
know how it is that this little baby girl came to fall asleep while the water's pouring on her. But it brings home the point that we've got to be careful what we associate falling asleep with. And this brings us to two of the most evidence-based treatments that we have. They're called stimulus control and sleep restriction. Now, before we go into them, I will say that you can make great progress with a young person with regularizing bedtime and regularizing wake-up time. The time to do stimulus control and sleep restriction is when the person is spending a lot more time in bed than they're actually sleeping. And I also want to warn you that these seem really counterintuitive, but they actually work very strongly. I did spend 10 years trying to develop an alternative treatment because I really didn't feel good about doing these treatments with clients. But then I had to be clinical supervisor for these treatments. And, you know, I've also got to look at the science. They're very effective treatments. So there's a time and a place to use them, and that time and a place is when someone's spending a lot of time in bed, like 10 hours time in bed, and maybe getting like 7.5 hours time of sleep, something like that. So the recommendation is to only go to bed when sleepy. And our responsibility as the providers is to help people to develop habits that will help them to be sleepy at an appropriate time of the day. It's also to use the bed only for sleeping. And if they're unable to get to sleep in like 20 minutes, move to another part of the room or another room in the house, if they've got more than one room, and to stay up until they're really sleepy, because the goal is that we want to associate the bed with falling asleep. And then we repeat this as often as necessary. And typically you only have to repeat it twice and people are fast asleep again. And here's that recommendation that I said, I hope you'll remember in 10 years, awaken at the same time every morning, regardless of the amount of sleep you got. And we try to encourage people not to nap while they're doing this. So this is also good, say, for someone who's waking up in the middle of the night and is worrying and ruminating. I think getting up out of bed sort of cuts into the worry and rumination. Now, the sleep restriction therapy, we get people to keep a sleep diary and we actually calculate their total sleep time and their time in bed. And we calculate a score that's called sleep efficiency. And then we cut the time in bed to the actual amount of time the person slept. But for young people, this was the original recommendation, 5 hours a night from Art Spielman. But for young people, we wouldn't go below 6.5 to 7 hours. And we prohibit sleep outside of those hours. And guess what happens? You start to sleep very solidly, very quickly, because you're a little bit sleep deprived, or maybe a lot sleep deprived. And after an average of 5 nights, the sleep efficiency will bounce up, and then you increase time in bed by 15 minutes. So I can talk more about this later if helpful. I just want to finish on a couple of kind of like relax the mind strategies, a couple of kind of thoughts. You know, the moment of the head hitting the pillow can be a time when there are just floods of worry and intrusive thoughts. And I think what we've got to do is kind of reassociate the head hitting the pillow with positives. And we teach people some of these skills in the treatment. Now, there's formal negative automatic thought forms. We won't go into those. You know, we don't suggest people do these in the middle of the night, and I know you probably cover them in other workshops and trainings. But what I want to cover are these kind of like short ultra brief practices. Suggestion is practice them first in the session together. only practice one or two at a time, and to manage expectations. So by that, I mean, say to the young person, like, this is like a muscle. It's going to take time to build. You know, you don't do your exercise and expect the muscle to have grown by tomorrow. Similarly, you need to practice this for a couple of weeks before you get to see if it's going to be helpful for you. And so I'll send these resources along, but these are all evidence-based. Colin Carney's done some work on just creating 2 columns. This is like 2 hours before bed, one labeled concerns and one labeled like the first step toward a solution. You don't have to completely solve it, just the first step. Gratitude practice, think of 3 things you're grateful for. Worry time, at least 2 hours before bedtime. Journaling and imagery. Close your eyes and think of a relaxing scene. Use 5 senses to bring them all to mind. So these can be very helpful. So at this point, I want to finish up. I've given you a little bit of the biological grounding, some suggestions about assessment and case conceptualization, and a little taster of the transdiagnostic treatment. And at this point, I want to thank you all very much for your attention. And I guess turn it back over to Brad, who might lead us in a discussion now. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, outstanding. Thank you so much, Dr. Harvey. That was truly terrific. We have a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, and we have even 1 or 2 questions prior before we started using the Q&A. So I might turn that. I'll read one of them. I'll read one now, and then we'll formally turn to the Q&A parts. As we're doing that, as we said in the beginning, we have our medical director, administrator, as well as chief psychologist. So Kurt and Scott and Jamie, anytime you guys want to jump in or comment, please feel free to do so, but no pressure. Maybe we can turn it to the first question that cropped up prior to the Q&A, formal Q&A. This one is from Blake Roberts. And well, actually, I'm just going to copy and paste it and put it in here so everybody can see to everyone. Let me see here. Allison, can you see that with irregular sleep patterns?
Is it in the Q&A? Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do this one
Brad.
first, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah. So with irregular sleep patterns, subcortical development and prefrontal development, does the prefrontal region ever catch up? Yeah, it does. Like about 25, 26 years of age, it helps. It catches up. So, yeah. And I'm glad, Bruce, that the talk on sleep reset your ultradian rhythms stopped you from having this deep afternoon dip that us in California would usually have.
Thank you. So Dr. Harvey, is it okay now if I think you can see the Q&A button?
I can, yeah. Shall I go through those?
At your leisure, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
So thank you, Jeffrey. The unique problems in sleep with autistic youth. This is an area that one of my students, Dr. Lauren Asanow, now a faculty at UCSF, is working on. We don't know that much. There have certainly been some trials with melatonin that looked effective. And I think a lot of these principles are very appropriate too. But we haven't done a specific trial, so the evidence base is not there for the sort of approach that I've been discussing. Yeah, definitely a big, important area for the future. And then, Robert, what advice would you recommend for clients who work late and want to get quality time during the later hours with their children before bed? Yeah. Yeah, that is a real challenge, isn't it? I think sometimes it helps with families to do a formal assessment of the timing of everything, like how the family schedule is working, like who wakes up when and what time do they go off to work. And what time do people get home? What do they do first when they get home? Sometimes when we do that, we find another place where there could be quality time between a parent and children, maybe in the morning. Little kids can wake up pretty happily early. It's when we get into the teenage years that they're not happy waking up early. So little kids can get that quality time with parents if the parent doesn't have to leave for work too early. But then the other thing we sometimes discover is that there could be like some rejiggling of the order of things at night. So like if the parent comes home and quickly clears out the email that's accrued during their commute, maybe they could be doing that later after the young person's bedtime and get the young person off to bed a little bit earlier. But this is a real challenge and a real problem, for sure. There's no easy answers for that one. And then Leslie, what do you think about the idea that adolescent night owl tendencies are based in hormonal physiological factors that were partially formed by evolutionary factors, that adolescents were the guards for hunter-gatherer bands in prehistoric times, and their wakefulness at night conferred an evolutionary advantage? Is there evidence that youth natural sleep is delayed relative to adults? Yeah, there is. Mary Cascadden has done really elegant science to show that the biological rhythm is delayed, but it's only delayed a bit. And it's the psychosocial factors that make that little delay into a multi-hour delay. And I do think that these evolutionary accounts are very interesting and possibly hold some credibility. But I think we can still do interventions in a couple of ways. I don't know what high school start times are in Hawaii. Brad, do you know what high school start times, or does it depend on the district or the region?
Yes, I think it varies a little bit, but it's not. It's on the early. I mean, other people, Scott, or I know Scott has recently had kids in high school. Mine hasn't entered yet. Scott or Jamie, I don't know, late between 7:30 and 8 start times.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the classes they're taking too. So my kid had marching band, which would start at 7, and most of his other classes started at 8.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So that's early for teenagers. So, one of the interventions we can do at the kind of more policy level is to start schools later. You might have seen California now has a rule across the state. No high schools can start before 8:30 a.m., I believe. And of course, when you're busing kids in, as we do in California, kids can be starting really early and getting those buses super early. And from the biologic standpoint, a lot of kids can't manage that. Some definitely can, but for others, that's really, really very challenging. Yeah. These are interesting questions. Thanks to you all. So Jeffrey, is there truth to the rumor that taking very short naps, like 10 minutes to let the mind wander, won't diminish homeostatic pressure to sleep. So that's interesting. Sarah Mednick is a UCSD, UC San Diego researcher. She has a couple of TED Talks on this, and I highly recommend watching those. If you're like a 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. sleeper, if you take that 10 minutes before 3 p.m., I think it would be fine. And if you're a pretty good sleeper. But if you're someone who wakes up in the early hours of the morning, the 10 minutes might contribute to those early hour of the morning awakenings. You know, when we're talking about sleep, we're always talking about like 8+ tweaks that we're looking for. And so it's never one thing. And so I think most of the time you can absolutely do a 10-minute nap. And I think it can really be refreshing. And Sarah Mednick, Matt Walker does nap studies. You know, the evidence is good that it can help us for that kind of afternoon period. But I always worry about the nighttime. And I worry about people who have more vulnerable sleep or more vulnerable sort of emotional functioning. And there it may not be the best. Happy to, with all of these, please come back with more questions because I'd love to kind of hear your response and, you know, have a back and forth if you would like. And then David brings up, in the context of the previous question, do you think school start terms should cater toward adolescent rhythms, and any special advice for hypomanic children whose nighttime energy may not always respond to dim lights? Is there long-term risk to frequent melatonin use? So yeah, happy to talk more about school start times. Yeah, I mean, even for my 5-year-old, I've selected the school in part for the start time. You know, he's kind of a late guy, so he'll change, I imagine, through development. Now, bipolar disorder, hypomania, this is a very important group of young people in terms of sleep. We've done a study, it was with adults, but I think it's reasonable to think that it might be true for teenagers as well. If you can stabilize sleep, you can actually reduce hypomania and reduce mania and reduce depression over even just a 6-month period. And I think we've got to adapt some things. So I agree, dim lights might not be enough. Sometimes I think we actually need darkness. People with bipolar disorder, there's a little bit of evidence, are more sensitive to light. So maybe even dim lights is too much light. And I think developing other wind down strategies and wake up strategies, and looking at the overall schedule for regular bedtimes and regular wake up times. The thing with music and audiobooks is that they can be pretty arousing. So going back to paper books might be a little bit better if it's acceptable, when I know that it's not really so much part of the culture in many cases. Long-term melatonin use, I don't think we know too much about long-term melatonin use. Melatonin is very interesting, and it's difficult to do research on. There's not really a drug company who stands to benefit financially, so it's really hard to get good data on melatonin use, but we definitely need it. And I've seen a lot of writing recently, and I think I agree with it, that at the moment, we can get melatonin over the counter, but we don't know the quality of it. Sometimes people think they're getting a tiny quantity and they're getting a large quantity, and they think they're getting a large quantity and they're getting a tiny quantity. So just, it may need to be regulated more. And I am very aware that we have Dr. Humphreys here, who I would defer to on all of these medication questions. And please chime in, Kurt, anytime.
I don't want to disrupt the flow, but I did have some thoughts about
Please, would
melatonin that
love
I
to
was gonna
hear. Yeah.
share. I in the last few weeks, I've noticed some articles on websites, things that I just look at, kind of talking about are we over medicating ourselves kind of as a nation with melatonin? There are so many adults and kids who are taking melatonin every day and for months and years and kind of throughout their lifetime. And some articles even talking about some children now presenting to emergency rooms for a melatonin overdose, perhaps.
Mhm.
So you know, maybe a little bit more indication that as a society, we're paying a little bit more attention to this medicine and, you know, wondering, you know, just where do the risks, benefits kind of, how do they, you know, balance out kind of over short-term and long-term uses of this, and how beneficial is it that we have such sort of free access to it over the counter and in our medicine cabinets? I didn't understand until reading some of these articles that I guess in a lot of other countries, it is not available over the counter. It is kind of a prescription only medicine in maybe some European I forget some of the facts of these articles, but very interesting, you know, kind of reading. And I'm not really an expert on melatonin per se, but I would say that I have a lot of experience in prescribing it to adolescents, uh, particularly because in the last several years, the patients that I've seen the most of are these youth that are in correctional and detention facilities, where the sleep and wake time is highly regimented. There is really kind of no choice given to kids in terms of what time you will go into your cell and what time the exterior lights will be turned off and what time you're supposed to be in your bed and what time you're supposed to be sleeping and what time you're going to wake. It's all very set. And a lot of the kids will talk about things like how difficult it is for them to sleep in this environment for a lot of reasons. One of them being also that the exterior, they can turn the lights off inside the cell in the room where they're kept, where they're sleeping, but there's, you know, windows in there so that the guards can see, and very bright exterior lights that keep the external environment very stimulating, because the guards need to be awake at all times to do their jobs, so they can't be in dim light, otherwise they'll start falling asleep. Anyway, so the light's shining in, and then the kids want to like put things on the windows to block the light, but then you get in trouble for that if you do that in a correctional facility. So anyway, and it turns into this whole power struggle over the sleep and so anyway, I give a lot of those kids melatonin, a lot of them, and sometimes they stay on it for many months, and I don't always feel good about it. I feel sometimes a little guilty about it, but sometimes I feel like in my kind of harm reduction way of thinking, I think it's probably helping them get to sleep a little faster, maybe making them sleepy enough that they can kind of overcome whatever the other issues are with sleeping in a correctional facility, the lights, the noise, all of these other things that are happening around them. I think it's I have not seen any real negative effects from having many of these kids on for melatonin for long periods of time. But that said, I worry about, I'm not sure we really know for sure what it does to the pineal gland, to if you're taking this external source of melatonin, sometimes the quantities I think are maybe too much. Even 3 milligrams, which is kind of I think a standard tablet size dose of melatonin for a lot of companies. It's like that's your basic starting dose. That's that's a lot compared to, I think, I forget what the natural amount of melatonin that is secreted by the pineal gland every night, but it's more in the terms of like micro grams, I think, compared to milligrams, I think. So it's even it's a smaller amount. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I do worry sometimes about, well, so what is this doing to the natural physiology of the brain and how it's supposed to put us to sleep? And so I do want to try to get those kids off of the melatonin if possible. And so I do really try to incorporate some of these other things that from the transdiagnostic, sleep treatment approach, what you're talking about, to help set a more reasonable expectation of sleep, and all of those other things. So I do try to work them off if possible, but honestly, sometimes the kids, they just seem to need that extra, and I think the benefits outweigh the risks a lot of the time for that special population anyway. I that's my own calculation. I think it's more helpful than harmful, but maybe for your average outpatient who could implement a lot more of the things that you talked about in your presentation much more effectively, because they would have the ability to do a good wake up routine and wind down routine and so on. I would probably be even quicker to try to move away from any kind melatonin or any other medicinal solution, just because I worry about the long-term effects for altering the circadian rhythm and different things like that. So that's my 2 cents on that. But
Extremely valuable. Thank you so much, Dr. Humphrey. That's such a vivid example of, there's a time and a place for melatonin, and a time and a place for helping young people develop behavioral and psychological habits that will hopefully last a lifetime of good sleep health, regular bedtimes, regular wake-up times, etc. And, just to sort of build on your thinking there, I have asked some of my circadian colleagues, so if we take melatonin, what might that be doing at the synapse? Like, if you're flooded with melatonin, does that then send a signal that your SCN doesn't need to release it? And they said, we don't know, but the circadian colleagues do say, and there's some writing about this, concern about the interaction with pubertal hormones. So again, there's a time and a place in the harm reduction approach. You got to get people sleep, and especially vulnerable young people like the group that you're working with. Kurt, in the chat, there was one question for you. Did you ever think about giving the kids eye shades? Would that be workable?
that is a wonderful suggestion, but the types of items that the kids are allowed to have, I mean, oftentimes there's a real uphill battle getting the security staff to view these items as necessary and
Right.
helpful, as opposed to everything is a potential contraband hiding or ligature risk type item in their eyes, and so it's always very it's a struggle to get security staff to see some of these types of very common sense. I mean, that's a very common sense, very great idea. But to see that as, something that's not going to end up causing contraband to be snuck inside a sleep mat, an eye mat, that's how they think. They're thinking first and foremost about making sure the kids are safe and that no dangerous items are coming. And so that's always an issue, but that's it's common sense enough. It's worth bringing to them and to try to see if we could maybe make that shift there. That's a good thought.
Yeah. Interesting. David put in the Q&A an article on the precocious puberty possibility with melatonin. This is a great discussion. Yeah, thank you. So, and feel free, others, of course, to chime in. Susan asked, have you associated youth mental health issues with parents' sleep patterns? We tried to do that. We tried to propose that, and NIH cut that bit out of the grant, so we didn't get to do that. I do think that's important. Parent sleep matters too. And also parent sleep patterns impacting youth sleep patterns. It's also important. And then Nada asks, what do you suggest to motivate teens who do not want to change their sleep habits despite all the facts you might give them? They're addicted to online games and all their friends are also awake all night on social media. They've got big fear of missing out. Parents are maybe not there to really scaffold. This is a really hard one. It's, I guess in psychology, it's called that delayed discounting, where if you have something very fun that you can get now, even though you realize that you're on a path to not getting to do what you want to do at the end of school, you're going to take the thing now that's fun rather than delay until you get that big thing at the end of school, going to the end of college or whatever it is. So, there's no kind of magic bullets that we've found. One of the things that we try to do is get to know the young person enough to know what their motivational levers are. Like, what are the things they really, really care about? Is it athletics? Is it school? Is it appearance? Is it some performance, creating music? Is it maybe even doing well in online games? And try to link getting better sleep to that. A second possibility is sometimes to suggest to people, would you be interested in trying it? Or might you try it just for 2 nights, just to kind of see what happens? Sometimes people are willing to try it just for 2 nights. Sometimes people also might be willing to do some sort of harm reduction approach, where they do some of the online games, but switch off at a certain point. And the big issue of how to switch off would get a lot of attention, like what's the cue going to be? Something probably more than an iPhone alarm that can be easily switched off. I wonder if others have ideas about this. I know many of you do this work and have probably found some things. Many of you are parents. Please do chime in with other things. I think they're the initial, but that is our biggest struggle for sure. Yeah. The harm reduction too is around the light exposure. So coaching people into how to do the settings on whatever console, computer they're doing the online games. Maybe doing the blue blocking glasses if they've got the money to buy those. These are big issues. Oh, one thing about screen time that I think is worth noting is I do wonder if there will be a time and a place where it is helpful. We have had some very worried clients who worry a lot. And if they wake up in the middle of the night and they're kind of into worry mode, you know, the whole system of fight and flight has switched on. Watching a calming rerun or a show they enjoyed from childhood can be very helpful, I think. So there might just be some situations where you know, it's appropriate. But we can talk more about that. I also know we're running out of time a little bit. So what's your take on the monophasic cycle, the biphasic cycle, the everyman cycle, the Dymaxion cycle, and the Uber cycle of sleep? Well, now you're teaching me some things. I'm going to have to look up all these things. So I guess the monocycle is where, you know, we go to bed at 11 and we wake up at 7. The biphasic is the way historically we apparently slept. So going back before electric lights, we would go to sleep at dusk and sleep for a few hours. Then we would actually get up and have some food, like at about 2, 3 a.m., and then go back to sleep for the second cycle. But I don't know the other cycles. And I'd be pleased if you wanted to add any details about those, Casey. I will educate myself. But I think the biphasic cycle doesn't work in some cultures. So I know the culture here in the Bay Area, in California, everyone has to be up early, being productive. You know, we've even got this notion, right, of sleep efficiently. You know, boy, can't we just drop efficiency for like the night at least? Of course, there are cultures where we can have an afternoon nap in the Mediterranean, and that's a different kind of biphasic cycle, if you like, where all the shops close down, people go home from school, they have a nap. So, you know, if it's culturally consistent and the person can pull it off, I think that would be really nice. You know, many of us as we move through the age range struggle with that sort of wake up in the early hours of the morning. And probably there's an evolutionary reason that that biphasic cycle was there. But it's just hard to manage in this cycle, at this culture, I think. Yeah. Brad, I think that brings us to the end of the questions in the chat. It might be worth just seeing if others want to chime in on
Sure.
any
No,
of
thank you.
these
Thank you, Dr.
things.
Harvey. I think actually, so just circling back, this might be perfect timing. Maybe if you could, there are a couple of more questions that popped up in the chat. I'm going to repost them here if you might consider them.
Great. Yeah.
This first one from our chief psychologist, Dr. Hernandez Armstrong. So we got 3 more if we have time, Q&A, but this first one is from Jamie here.
Terrific. Hi, Jamie. Since we work so much with traumatized youth, any information or tips you have for working with traumatized youth specifically? Yeah, so the vigilance model of sleep, I think, is the one to be thinking of. You know, we've somehow got to crawl into our safe burrows and our safe nests. And And then we're also working often with nightmares. And if the group here would like a workshop from some nightmares experts, I can make some recommendations. The nightmares treatments are very simple and very, very effective. And then I think we're often working with intrusive thoughts and fear as people are going off to sleep. Sometimes the trauma has happened in the home, in the bedroom, so that adds another layer. And, you know, I think it's almost a really good one for a whole sort of specialized workshop, because it's so important and so relevant. But I think a lot of the principles are the same. I think there's often a sort of a procrastination on bedtime, because bedtime, getting into bed, being in darkness, that can be a time of lots of intrusive thoughts. And so then there are some very late bedtimes. So working with youth to bring those back to a regular bedtime, and, you know, maybe giving some of these skills in relax the mind strategies. Yeah, I think there are a couple of things to be thinking about, but I'm really happy to make some recommendations. I just had to come up with some for Ukrainian. We're doing some workshops in Poland for Ukrainian refugees, and I did the sleep side, and some colleagues are doing the nightmare side. And then, are these treatments helpful with children with ADHD as well? There is a small evidence base with children with ADHD, and they are effective, very similar principles. Absolutely. Yeah. Many adolescents spend their leisure time, study time, and visiting with friends in their rooms. However, their space is limited. How would they create space that allows for the bed not to be a central piece of the furniture? Yeah, we come up with all kinds of things. So sometimes it's just making the bed and sitting on it rather than in it. Sometimes it's trying to create like a little nesting place, a safe nest with a comfy chair somewhere else in their room that they would spend a lot of their time, but really trying to come up with a difference between the position at night and the position in the day. So the other thing is sitting on the bed, not lying in the bed. But that one is a common one, to kind of do some creative work around how to demarcate the bed for sleeping. And, you know, part of me thinks with young people, the stimulus control and the sleep restriction are much less important than just trying to get the light dim and bright light on waking. Oh, that one's so important. And managing expectations as you make that recommendation, because it's not going to make a difference tonight, but over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, if you can get some light in the morning, it'll make a really big difference. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Trina was with Adrian. Wonderful. You got some good sleep tuition with Adrian. So many connections here. It's so nice.
It's wonderful. So I think that brings us to a close on behalf of the State of Hawaii Evidence-Based Services Committee, through Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division, as co-sponsored with HPA, as well as all of our social work partners here. Just a deep note of gratitude and appreciation. So grateful for your time and expertise, and just really, really grateful. And thank you, Dr. Harvey. I think
My
that brings us
pleasure.
to a close.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harvey. That was wonderful.
Thank you.